friends, do you ever feel like you're stuck in an ink blending rut with your stencils? I'm Juliana Michaels and I love ink blending, but today I want to show you just how versatile stencils can be when you explore other mixed media techniques. We're going to create 3 completely different backgrounds using techniques like monoprinting, layering translucent and opaque texture paste, and even adding splatters with distressed Foundry Wax. I'm using the beautiful new Botanical stencils from Vicki Boutin's first release with Sizzix. But here's the thing, these techniques work with any stencils you have in your stash. So grab whatever florals, geometrics, or textures you have on hand, and let's play with some mixed media magic. I'll also be sharing the techniques I used to create the embellishments on the finished cards. If you're interested in any of the supplies I'm using today, the Sizzix stencils, texture paste, Foundry Wax, or any of the other products, you'll find all the links in the description box below. Now let's get into it. So in this video, I'm going to be working with some of the new Sizzix and Vicki Boutin stamps and dies and stencil sets. So Vicki Boutin is a new designer with Sizzix, and so this is her first release with them. And she has 2 stamp and die sets. So this one is called Floral Layers number 1, and this is Greenery Layers number 1. And I will go into a little more detail about what I love about these in the video, but they are a stamp and coordinating die set where you can cut and layer and create just unending possibilities with these sets. So if you love greenery, butterflies, and flowers, you may have a new favorite stamps and die sets with these. And then she also has 2 new stencil sets, and her stencil sets come in packs of 4, and they're really large size stencils. The actual stencil art piece is like 5 by 8 inches, so they're pretty good size. And then there are 2 sets. I will be working with Buildable Botanicals 1, but there is also this Buildable Backgrounds number 1, but I won't be using this one for these cards. And then the other stamp set I'll be using is Birdsong, and I'm really just using it for this script stamp here, so any kind of a script stamp would work. And that said, you do not need any of these stamps and dies or stencils to do the techniques that I'm going to be sharing. You could work with anything that you have in your stash. I'm just going to share a quick look at the patterns that are in this stencil pack. So there is this one here, and this kind of floral one that's got a little bit of like script around it, and this all over floral one, and then this kind of like leaves greenery one. So they're all have a really nice, beautiful floral kind of organic vibe to them, other than this one. But I think I love a repeat pattern like this, and they just all really layer and go together beautifully to create lots of different options, using them either by themselves or together. So as far as the mediums go, I'm working with a variety of 49 and Market dye inks. So these are water reactive inks, and these have just come out in new colors, and so I have used a variety of the older original release colors and some of the new colors. Obviously you don't need this many colors, and you don't need to use these exact colors. These are just the ones I have. So I've got Sunrise, which is kind of a peachy, orangey, almost rusty orangey color. This Fossil and Mint Chill. And then I've got Rainforest, Shamrock, Lavender Kisses, Tranquil Waters, Arctic Blitz, Sangria, and Camouflage. And I've just got a variety of greens and this kind of gray color here to use for the greenery pieces. And then I used these blues here, specifically the Tranquil Waters and Arctic Blitz. I used those to create the backgrounds on the cards. And along those notes, I'm also using the re-inker for Arctic Blitz to do some of the techniques in the video. And then the light and dark purple and this sunrise color here are being used for some of the embellishments that we'll be creating in the video as well. And then I'm also going to be working with some texture paste, and I've got texture paste opaque, which is just a matte paste that is opaque, so it's white and you can't see through it. And then I also have texture paste translucent. So this is translucent where you can see through it, and it has a gloss finish, so it's actually shiny. And then lastly, I'm going to use Distress Foundry Wax in Mind. And when we're working with that, you're also going to need some isopropyl alcohol at 90%. For the papers, I'm going to be using Distress watercolor cardstock to create all the backgrounds for the cards and to create some of the embellishment die cut layers. I really recommend some sort of mixed media or watercolor paper because of the variety of mixed media techniques that we're going to be using, especially because we're going to be using some wet techniques and paste and things like that. So you want something that can handle that mixed media type stuff. And then I'm also going to be using some different colors of cardstock to do some die cutting. So I use some metallic rose gold paper. And then I also have these other colors here, kind of a dark green and a dark purple and a lighter purple. So I'm working with the buildable botanical stencils, and this is stencil number 4. And I've got my stamp and stencil platform here and a piece of distressed watercolor cardstock that I've cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. And I've kind of placed my stencil in here already, but I like, especially with this kind of a pattern that's very symmetrical, I like to kind of get that design centered on my cardstock. So I'm going to kind of play around here a little bit just to get the pattern centered, and then I can kind of figure out from there where I need to put my paper underneath here on the grid, and that just kind of helps keep everything really nice and centered and even, if that's your thing. So we'll get that lined up there. And so now you can kind of see that pattern is relatively centered. As it's maybe could come down just a little tiny bit there. There we go. And now I'm going to take some of the 49 and Market dye inks and the blending tool, and I'm going to apply some of the color that's called Tranquil Waters through the stencil. Now, if you want to just kind of give this a light coverage, which is really what I'm going for, sometimes I like to kind of wipe off some of that excess ink on, onto like another surface, just so I don't have too much of it on my brush. So, you can just kind of wipe a little bit of that onto the stencil here if you like, just so it's not super dark. And then I'm just going to lightly apply that ink to the paper here. And then I can go back and kind of grab some of that excess ink that's on the stencil there and pull it around onto the paper here where I want to add more ink. And I am not pushing hard. I'm just barely rubbing this stencil brush over the surface here. So it just gives me a very nice light coverage. And then if you want to go a little darker with this, then you can come back in and take a little bit of that Arctic Blitz, which is just the darker color. And I'll put a little bit of that over here, tap off some of that excess. And then I'm just going to kind of start on the outer edges and kind of work that darker color around the edges here just to add a little interest. Now if you want this darker, then you could go on the paper here with like that ink full strength if you want it on the brush and not tap anything off, but I just wanted to kind of just give it a real light coverage there. And then from here, we can just lift up our stencil, and then, you can kind of look and see, are you happy with how that looks? Do you want it darker? Maybe you want more ink on there. So you can kind of I think I'm going to go a little darker on on that middle area. So I'm gonna go back to my Tranquil Waters, that lighter color, and just, again, very lightly go back over the center here. You can peel that up and take a look, and then, yeah, happy with that. All right, so now we can peel this up and then just set this to the side. You can just wipe this clean with a wet rag, or you can wash it in the sink with a little soap and water if you like. Now we're going to add some more layers of interest to this. So I'm going to work here in my splat box just to kind of keep the ink contained, because I want to do some splatter work right now. So the first thing I want to do is just give this a little bit of a spritz with some water. These inks are water reactive, so they're going to kind of get reactivated when you apply water to them. And then I'm working on watercolor paper, so it can handle that excess water nicely. Then we can just give that a little dry. It's going to just be a subtle bit of interest that this is going to add at this point, but we're going to continue to add layers that will build up and create a beautiful mixed media looking background. And if you pick up the paper while you're drying it with your heat tool, it will dry a little bit faster because that air can get around and underneath the paper. So there you can see just that subtle little interest that's added with the water splatters. Now we're going to add some ink splatters. So I've got just a little craft mat here that I'm going to kind of squish my ink pad down onto the mat to transfer water onto. And then we're going to spritz that with some water. And then we can take a paintbrush, pick up that ink, and then add little splatters here and there. If you want them darker, you could use the darker ink. Here I use that lighter blue, the Tranquil Waters. And then again, you could just give that a dry. But you can add as many splatters as you like, but that lighter color just gives it just a slight subtle effect with the splatters. And then at this point, I kind of thought about adding some stamping to the background just to add a little bit of some interest as well with that. So let's do some of that here next. And because of the effect that I'm going for, I'm not going to use a stamping block or any kind of stamping tool. I'm just going to use the stamp and my fingers to do the stamping. And this is just a script image from the 49 and Market Birdsong stamp set. And I'm just going to ink it up here with the fossil ink from 49 and Market. So you can do it like I just did, or you can tap it on the top, whichever you prefer. And then this is a real light color, so I'm just going to add a little bit of stamping, and I'm just using my fingers to just kind of stamp parts of the stamp onto the paper. So I'm not going for full image or anything, and I'm also kind of going for like that second generation stamping where I'm just kind of using whatever ink is still left on the stamp. I'll ink it up again here, kind of do that same thing along the other side. Just using my fingers to apply parts of that stamp here and there. And then just kind of taking whatever I get. If nothing shows up, then there's absolutely no ink left, so I can kind of go back over that again. Maybe there might. And then if you're completely running out of ink, just ink it up again. There we go. I want to get a little bit here in the center. You can always, if you want a little bit more than what you got, just add a little bit more. All right. And I'm really just kind of putting it around the outer edge because the center I'm going to have covered up pretty much with the embellishments. And then we can just give that a quick dry. And at any stage, you might be completely happy with how this looks and just want to stop, and that's enough layers for you. But if you want to continue on with the mixed media journey, we're going to go back to another one of the stencils from that stencils pack, and this is the second stencil in that set. And this one, I'm going to kind of move my paper around a little bit, I think, with this, because I really like this scripty part on here. And then I'm just going to use my palette knife here to apply some of the texture paste through the stencil. So I'll just put a little bit up here. Like I said, I really kind of want to get the areas that have that kind of scripty section on here. And I don't mind getting a little bit of the flowers. That's totally fine too, because it will add, point is to add some texture here and there. And then you might notice there's a little bit more text down here. So I'm going to peel this up, and I'm going to take this out, and you can either set this to the side and let it dry, or if you're using the distressed texture paste, you can actually use your heat tool and just heat that, and just take a couple minutes to dry that paste with your heat tool. But just keep it moving and don't hold it in one spot for too long. And then you can move on to the next step here with me. And then just like to know that it's dry. I mean, if you touch it and it's not moving around anymore, you're probably pretty good there. So now I'm just going to slide this under and line it up so that I can get this area with some of that texture paste. There we go. And we can just peel that up. And then I'm going to set this to the side to dry. A little bit much there, so I'll just knock some of that back. And then from here, I'm just going to set this to the side to dry, and then I'm going to get my stencil here to the sink to wash off, as well as my palette knife. And if you've got some, paste there on your mat, you can just, scrape that off as well. And as you can see, I've been using this sticky mat for a while, so just keep going till stuff won't stick anymore. And now that the paste is dry, here is a look at the background so far. So the final thing I'm going to do is add some splatters using distressed Foundry Wax. So you just want to make sure you shake this up really well. There's a little mixing ball in there that you want to make sure you get that moving and shaking it up and mixed in really super well. And then once that's shook up, you're going to add a little bit of that to your craft mat. And then we're going to add a little bit of isopropyl alcohol. So this is the 90%. So it's more alcohol than water. Just add a couple drops, and then you're going to take a paintbrush, whatever you want to use for your splatters, mix that together, and then add your splatters. Now it's not going to look like much until we add the heat to this. So just kind of bear that with me here for a second, because it looks kind of dull and boring. But you're going to need your heat tool to get the full effect of this wax. So once you're finished with the splattering, then you're just going to heat this with your heat tool, but just like kind of like if you were heat embossing, and you're going to slowly see those dots and splatters become shiny. And just kind of keep moving your heat tool over the surface until all the spots have changed over and are shiny. And there you have it. So that's the final layer for this card. Now, if you wanted to, maybe ink the edges up and darken it up a little bit, that's something you could kind of do once you're completely finished with the card, embellishing it. Maybe you want to add a little darker border. This could be trimmed down to put a white mat on, or some other kind of colored cardstock or colored mat, whatever you desire there. And then as far as cleaning this up, just a little more rubbing alcohol can be used, and actually this will just really turn into kind of like a dust one, because it will like completely dry up. It only becomes permanent when you apply that heat, and then you can just wipe that out of your brush and you're good to go. And if you want to do a little rubbing alcohol in there to really get it all out, you can. I don't like to leave rubbing alcohol on my brush though, so I do usually rinse that off a little bit with some water. And it's good to go then. Now, if you want to come back in and add a little bit, like darken this up a little bit, you can, which I kind of think I prefer to do. I'm going to trim this down to 4 by 5 1/4 inches because I'm going to mat this, and because I kind of centered that initial design, I'm going to equally cut off 1/8 of an inch on each side all the way around so that I kind of keep that design centered on the paper. And now I'm just going to take some of that Arctic Blitz because I want to go a little bit darker, and I'm just going to rub that around the edges here with my foam blending tool. If you wanted to blend it in onto the paper a little bit more, you could use like a blending brush like I did earlier. But I don't want the color too far in on the paper. I just kind of want it here around the edge to kind of create like a vignette kind of frame around the edges there. So there you go. So there is a look at the first background. Now on to the second background, and for this one we're back in the stencil platform. And I've got a piece of distressed watercolor cardstock in here cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches, and I again have kind of centered that design onto the paper. And now we're going to take the light blue, the Tranquil Waters, and the blending brush, and just going to ink that up here a little bit. I've got my craft mat here now, so I can use that to add a little bit of, or wipe off some of that excess ink. And now we're just going to kind of repeat what we did on that first background, where we just lightly inked up through the stencil with that color. And again, just very lightly rubbing the brush over the surface. I'm not pushing down hard. And the paper you use for this also is really key. Watercolor cardstock will handle ink like this. That's a dye ink, that's a water reactive ink really nicely and blend super nicely. So that's where we are for this layer. Next, we are going to do, we're going to use that same stencil, and this time we're going to work off of the platform. And you're going to take your stencil, and you're going to need at least a couple paper towels and your spray bottle. And I'm going to take that darker blue ink, and I'm going to apply the ink directly to my stencil. So you can kind of just lightly wipe it over the stencil. You can tap it down and just kind of apply it until you get where it looks like it's a pretty good coverage of ink onto the stencil. And now I'm going to spritz this pretty liberally with water. So just kind of give it a good good squirt. Almost so you can kind of get some of that water beading up on the stencil. And then you're going to very carefully pick that up. And as best as you can, you're going to try to line it up with the design that you stenciled from earlier. So just take your time. And then once you get it down, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect. You're going to take that other paper towel and then just use that to dab off any excess ink that kind of seeped through the stencil. Okay. Then you can kind of pick that up, push it around a little bit. And then I'm going to just gently lift off our stencil. And as you can see, you're going to get some areas where you might get this really cool outline. Some of it might end up being really solid. It just kind of depends on how much ink and water you got on the stencil. So I'm okay with it being a little bit not the same everywhere, but if you want it more even, then if you're brave, you can try re-inking and respraying and relining everything up. I've done that before, but it takes some patience, and I'm kind of like, let's just go with what we have here. Now there is still ink, on your craft mat. There's still ink on the stencil. If you want, you could spritz this again and do another print onto another piece of paper if you would like, so that you're not wasting that ink, and then would give you another background. But I am just going to clean it off and move on. And then we can just set this to the side and let it dry, or you can speed that up with your heat tool, whichever you prefer. And then some of those more stubborn spots, if you want to just dab those dry, you can. I'll just lift off a little bit of that ink and give you a little bit lighter effect in those spots. And now we're going to go back to our stencil platform and put my paper back in here. Now we're going to take stencil number 1 and apply it over the paper here. And we're going to take our blending brush again. And I'm going to use that Tranquil Waters again. So this is the lighter blue. And we're going to blend the ink through the stencil, just kind of here and there. It doesn't have to be everywhere. And you're going to see, because we're layering that same color on top of an already dried layer, you're going to get it, it's going to get darker just because you're layering these inks. Oh, I'm not going over the whole stencil. You can if you like. I'm just kind of doing little spots here and there. And then if you want to see kind of what you have, you just peel up that stencil and take a peek at it. It's just very subtle, but it's going to add a really nice layer of some texture and interest to the background. You can kind of go back over some sections if you'd like. And I'm holding the stencil just purely out of habit, because that's just me. But there we go. I wouldn't mind a little more down here. Let's backline this back up here. It's a nice thing about being able to line it back up. You can just repeat and do more if you want more. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay. So there is a look at where we are at this stage. So now at this point, I'm going to start adding some splatters. So you can use your spray bottle to do some of that. So just slowly pulling that trigger. And I'm not spraying straight down. I kind of hold it at a little bit of an angle up and slowly squeeze that trigger to get kind of bigger droplets. And then we can just give that a dry, or let it dry on its own, whichever you prefer. I always use my heat tool because it's faster. And I don't have much patience when it comes to waiting for things to dry. But you can see, because that ink is water reactive, how that water has reactivated that ink, even though it was dry, and got it, made it start moving around and kind of lifted some of it, and just really gives it a cool mixed media effect. All right, so as you can see, that's where we are at this point. If you wanted to stop, you certainly could. Of course, I want to kind of keep going and adding a little bit more. So I'm going to go back and add a few splatters with the Foundry Wax like we did earlier. Add a little drop of that to my mat. A couple drops of the rubbing alcohol. There we go. And then we'll just heat that to set it. And like I said earlier, this is not permanent until it's heat set. At this point, like when it's dull and not shiny, you could wipe it off with your finger. So just keep that in mind. You'd have to heat set the Foundry Wax. So there we go. And that's where we are at this point. All right, so now I want to add a little more splatters, and for this I'm going to go to the Arctic Blitz and do a little darker splatters. So smush that ink pad onto my craft mat, spritz it with a little water. You can also use the re-inker and just add a little water to that to do splatters if you like. By using ink pad and water, they're going to be a little lighter. If you use the re-inker, they're going to be darker and more intense, unless you add a lot more water. So there we are. And give that a dry. And there is a look at that background. Now, if you wanted to do like we did on this first background, if you wanted to add some of that script stamping, you could do that. You could ink the edges. Like there's so many options of more things that you can do to add to the backgrounds. All right, so now we're going to go on to the next background, and I have another piece of the Distress watercolor cardstock. This time I went ahead and cut it to 4 by 5¼ inches, which is probably what I should have done on the first one. But I've got the third stencil that's in that set, and I'm just going to position my cardstock here in my platform. I'm not super worried about centering this one or getting it even or anything like that on the design, because it's very organic pattern here. And now we're going to take the texture paste, but this is the translucent one. So the first one that we used is an opaque matte paste, so it's kind of has like that white finish to it. This one is translucent, but it's glossy, so it's going to be a little shiny. I want to add a little color to this. So what you can do is take your re-inkers and apply ink and color to the paste. So I'm just going to get a little bit of the paste out here onto my craft mat. And probably need a little bit more, because I want to do most of the background here. If your paste is like dried on the edge here from the lid or something, peel that off. Make sure you get that off, because then otherwise your lid's not going to go back on tight. And now we're just going to add just a couple drops. You don't want to add too much of the re-inker, because it will make the paste too thin, because it is a liquid. So you don't want the paste seeping underneath the stencil because it's too liquidy. But just want to keep mixing it in until, as you can kind of see, like there's little white streaks through it, or dark streaks from the ink. So you just want to kind of get it mixed in completely, so it's nice and even. And then from there, you just pick up a little bit of that and start applying it through your stencil. And just kind of like you're buttering toast. And just kind of hold it at a little bit of an angle. If you've got, you need to get a little bit more on there, you can kind of push down flat, but then go back at an angle there. Make sure I get most of this covered. So I'm not going for perfect coverage. You usually hear me say that when I'm working with my stencils. I don't usually go for it to be a perfect background coverage, but if you want that, go for it. It's kind of up to you. There we go. And then we're just going to very carefully lift off our stencil here. And then we're going to set this to the side and wash it. We don't want to let that paste dry on there. And then we can just let this sit here and dry. And then of course clean off your palette knife and your craft mat as well. So then once the paste is dry, we are going to take that Tranquil Waters ink pad. We're going to smush that onto our craft mat here. Spritz that with some water. And we're going to smush the paper into the ink. Kind of smushing it around. Pick and lift it up. Look and see where your ink is if you want more in spots. And just kind of keep smushing until you get ink everywhere that you want it. You can also pick it up and finger paint a little bit if you like. I'm just going to tap some of that excess ink off onto a paper towel if you like, and then dry that with your heat tool. And because you're drying with the paste, just make sure that you keep that heat tool moving and that you're not letting it sit in one spot for too long. You're just wanting to dry the ink, not heat the paste. You can also just set this to the side and let it dry if you prefer. And then once you have your heat tool off of it, give it just a few seconds to cool off, because if you put your fingers in that while it's still warm, you might get a fingerprint into the paste. So just kind of let that be. Now from here, you can re-ink again, like to add another layer. So I'm going to do that. Just get a little more ink on my craft mat here. Don't need a ton, but just kind of smush that around again a little bit. It'll add just another little layer of some interest. Feel like you need more? Add more. And if you've got areas that are white and you don't want those, you can always fill them in with your fingers, however you like there. And then go back and give that another dry. And again, just kind of tapping off, any of that excess ink that kind of goes to the edges of the paper. Just tap that off onto your paper towel. And there is a look at the finished background. Now again, if you wanted to add some splatters with the Foundry Wax, you could certainly do that. You could add some ink splatters, but you do want to remember that the paste is kind of a resist. So I'm just going to take like a light spritz of water onto a rag, and I'm just going to wipe over this to wipe off any ink that was sitting on top of that paste, because if this was a clean rag, you would definitely have seen, but that's all from what was sitting on top of that paste, because it's not going to dry. So just kind of keep that in mind. Make sure you wipe that off so you don't get ink on something that you didn't want it on because you forgot about it being on there. So there we go. So like I said with these first two, if you wanted to go in and add the Foundry Wax splatters to this, you could ink the edges with this one. Just lots of options with how to continue to add some interest to these. You could also add, spritz this with some water, which I think I'm going to do. Kind of break up a little bit of some spots here and there. And then give that another dry. And all those little things just add another little layer that adds to that mixed media look. Now we're going to get into our embellishments. So you can see I made a ton of embellishments here. And then for this, I'm using the new floral layers and greenery layers stamp and die set. So each of these come with a stamp set and then coordinating dies that cut out the stamps, and then also another layer that cuts out kind of an outline layer. And there's just so many ways you can use these, so many ways. So I'm just going to kind of go into some of that here. I'm not going to create all of these embellishments, but I'm going to create a few just to give you some ideas on how you can use these dies. So I just wanted to share a little bit about these stamps and dies, and just even though I didn't use the stamps on the cards here, I really love how they work all so well together. So you have this stamp image, and here I just stamped it onto watercolor cardstock and colored it in. But then there's a die that goes with it that cuts out along the edge of the stamped image, so you don't have any kind of a white border. And then you'll also notice that this die, not all of them, but some of them, like some of the flowers and some of the leaves, have a pattern or design in them that will kind of emboss a texture into them. So while you won't see it with the stamped image, if you cut it into plain cardstock, you're gonna hopefully maybe see a little bit of that design kind of embossed in there. Hopefully I'm catching it here on the camera. So I just wanted you to see that. And then if you want a border on this, there's another die that will cut an outer layer for this. And that's what I have here. So for this flower, I've cut out the flower shape, and then I also cut out this border piece and layered them together. So just lots of options when it comes to how you can create and put these together to create flowers and embellishments for your card. So that also holds true with this other stamp set as well. So this is the greenery layers. So this is floral layers number 1, and this is greenery layers number 1. And this set has the exact same thing with the dies, where it cuts out a detailed image of the stamp shape, and then it also has a shadow layer or outline layer, whichever you want to call it. As I was building and creating all of these embellishments, what I did was I took a piece of distressed watercolor cardstock and I ink smushed it with whatever color I wanted to use. So for this one, I'm going to do one with the sangria, which is a beautiful, rich purple color. And spritz that with some water after you smush your ink pad onto your craft mat, and you want to kind of let it bead up like that. And then you're just going to smush your paper into the ink. And you're just going to continue that until you get a nice coverage. You can have areas where it's, you know, white and no ink on it if you like. And then just going to give that a quick dry. And you can kind of tilt it so it kind of runs that ink around and tap off some of that excess. And because these inks are dye inks and they're water reactive, that's where you're getting that beautiful kind of watercolor effect with them. And if you wanted just to stop with just this one layer of color, you could. If you want to make this a little bit darker, because the color gets lighter when we add water to it because it dilutes that pigment a little bit. But once this is dry, you can re-smush and you're going to start building layers, and they're just going to get darker as you keep adding. So if you want to add more color, because you're, you know, just re-smush your ink pad down on here, you can, and then dab off that excess and kind of just keep repeating that process until you're happy with how the paper looks. If you don't like the little speckles, you want to add more water and kind of smush like rub your paper through the ink instead of dabbing it, because I kind of tend to dab and lift, where that gives me a little bit more of some of that speckly splatter looking effect. If you just repeat that process with every color. So for these leaves and some of the greenery pieces in here, I used Shamrock, Mint Chill, Rainforest, and Camouflage for the greens. And then on the some of the florals, I used Sangria and Lavender Kisses for the lighter purple. So that one's with the Lavender Kisses. And then this is Sunrise, so that's this kind of rusty orange color. And then I used, just on some of the centerpieces, I used kind of a rolled rose gold metallic on those. So, but yeah, so then, you know, I just made panels with each of these colors, and then I could die cut the various pieces from those. Now I also die cut some layers from just colored cardstock. When I'm die cutting pieces like this, I'd like to just cut out kind of around the shape I'm going to cut out. And then just position this on my die cutting machine here. And I'll just roll that through. That cracking noise is completely normal. And then we have a flower layer with just the die here. And then let's do one here with the watercolor paper. So again, you know, we'll kind of trimmed around that and place that other plate on top, and then just run this through here. And there, the flower cut out of the watercolor cardstock. And then just to add a little interest to these, you can ink blend the edges with like an ink blending tool. So here I'm taking the Sangria, which is that darker purple, and I'm just using a small little blending brush here and just putting a little bit of ink just around the edges here. Now, if you're working with cardstock like this kind of paper is going to absorb that ink really fast. So if you get it somewhere that you don't really want it, it's gonna stay there. It's not really gonna blend a whole lot. So you do want to use kind of a smaller blending brush, especially if you're working around these little edges here. So just kind of keep that in mind. But that just adds a nice little shadow to the flower. And you can do that on that shadow layer as well if you wanted to. And just go in and pop that around. But then you can also do it on the watercolor cardstock if you like. And then this, you're going to see that it is going to blend a little bit easier because of the nature of this type of paper. But it just gives it just a little shadow and depth. And, you know, if you want to get in here in the center a little bit, just lift those petals up and rub that brush kind of more in there to the center. So that is kind of the process that I used just to add some shadows and interest to some of these. Now I didn't do it on all of them. Like on this one here, I didn't ink the edges of that ink smushed layer, but you certainly could. And you know, like on the butterflies here, I didn't ink the edges of those or the greenery, but I just did it on some of the flowers just to add a little bit of interest. So here's just something interesting to point out. This was made with the Lavender Kisses. This was where I think I used a lot more water. You can see how much lighter it is, and this one's a little darker. And that one just has more ink and more smushing that occurred. So, and probably a little less water. And then, you know, I just used coordinating purple, light purple cardstock to go with those. And then lastly, just to add a little interest to the butterflies, I took a black pen and I just added some detail to the antenna and the body. I'm just kind of coloring that in. And it doesn't have to be perfect because, you know, we're kind of going with this mixed media style with the ink smooshing to color these. But it just adds a little bit of interest to the die cut and helps that kind of pop out. So there is a look at that. So yeah, so you can just, you know, sit down and, you know, once you've got your panels cut, you could just keep, you know, just cut as many as you want. You can make, you can make bigger panels. I just find like this was 4 by 5¼ inches or so. I find like going, you know, if I take an 8.5 by 11 and cut it into 4 pieces or maybe 2 pieces, that 5.5 by 8.5 is about all I can handle, like with ink smooshing, because it gets everywhere. It takes longer to dry, and I usually just find like doing just a small A2 size. That 4¼ by 5.5 inches is a good amount, and if I need more, then I can make another panel. So there we go. So from there, I'm just going to take all these various pieces and kind of create some clusters on each of the backgrounds that I created here, and then finish those off with the sentiments, and they'll be ready to go. So there you have it. 3 completely different mixed media backgrounds using the same stencils and all the techniques we used to create these floral embellishments. We had monoprinting for that soft watercolor effect, layered texture paste for dimension, and those fun distressed Foundry Wax splatters for texture and interest. The beauty of these techniques is that you can use them with any stencils, stamps, and dies you already have in your stash. I hope this inspires you to pull all those supplies out and play. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you gave it a thumbs up and subscribed for more crafty inspiration, tips, and techniques. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay crafty, my friend.